All right, welcome everyone. So this is my postmortem on the Gun Commando demo, which I don't know how many of you have checked out what's on the floor. That's not the demo I'm talking about. I'm talking about the very first version of the demo that went up on Steam in April 2026, after a month and a half of development. So I'm basically going to be talking about how did I get it stood up that fast. So who am I specifically? I moonlight as an anime villain when I'm not doing game development. And then obviously make games. I live with family in the Twin Cities, which is Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota area. I've also been a web developer and engineering manager and blog author. Some of you may have read my blog posts about Godot. And then I've been working on Godot games since 2019, since 3.0. My company is Lunacy Entertainment, and, well, my current game is Gun Commando, if you haven't figured it out by now. Anyway, this is Gun Commando. If I had more time, I'd show you the trailer, but we ain't got that kind of time, so we're moving on. So, why did I do all of this? So, I had a previous project called Dice Tower, where I worked on that for 3.5 years, and it unfortunately didn't get the traction it needed to continue working on it, so I made a pivot. Now, there were some problems with Dice Tower's work that I wanted to address in this pivot, one of it being it took way too long to develop. So I wanted to release a demo in 1 month and the entire project within about 4 months. So that was my initial goal. Gameplay was too complex in Dice Tower to develop content quickly for it. So I wanted to make a smaller and simpler design so that I could more easily build on it. And then finally, it was too expensive to make Dice Tower. It was a bespoke world with bespoke story, which meant bespoke assets and paying a lot for that. So I resolved I was only going to do things that I could either make myself or with asset packs. And since I am a terrible artist, that mostly meant asset packs or stuff that I've already contracted. All right, so with that in place, this was the game plan that I made back when I started the process of what became Gun Commando. I was going to plan what exactly I was going to work on because I didn't know yet it was going to be Gun Commando. And then the next step was whatever that plan was, execute it, and then finally reflect on the outcome of that and decide whether it was worth continuing. Okie doke. So let's start with the plan. This was my design mandate, dice plus an easier action genre. So Dice Tower was a dice-driven platformer, and marrying dice to platformers was freaking hard. But I already built this entire dice system that worked really well and was really cool. Plus, dice games are getting really popular on Steam, so it made sense for me to try to reuse those existing code and assets. But I wanted to make an easier action genre because, again, platformers are freaking hard to do well. So first, I needed to validate the gameplay. What was I going to pair dice with? So to that end, I stood up a couple of rapid prototypes. You may recognize some of those as GD Quest tutorials. I literally just took those and bolted my dice system onto them. First one was a tower defense sort of thing, which I tried and went, I don't know if I'm feeling that. And then the next one was a survivors like Bullet Heaven tutorial, and that one felt a little more promising. I did some play testing with these prototypes and got feedback on it, and the Bullet Heaven one was starting to look even more promising. The next thing I needed to validate was the art style. Since I was handling all of this myself and I am not a great artist, I was relying on asset packs. Now, there are some fairly well-known asset pack games, Vampire Survivors Cough, but I wanted to make sure that whatever I came up with, it would at least look decent, and that meant finding assets that worked well together, and that there were enough assets of that I could actually pull together some kind of comprehensive theme. And on top of that, I researched how to unify these assets. How do I convert all of them to use one single color palette? Because that unifying the color palette makes it feel more cohesive. And then lighting. I worked with lighting effects on Dice Tower, so that was something I already knew how to do. And then overall, it just helps cover up some of the incongruencies when you just can't see all of it. So with all of that, I decided to commit to this Bullet Heaven with dice synergy and this light mapped 2D pixel art style. With that, I made a giant to-do list and planned out the game. That is one section of, I think, a 1,000-line to-do list. And yeah, I set some milestones for what I was going to try to target when, made the core design of what I thought the game essentially needed to have, and I took a week to do all of this, and my goal was still get this out within a month. So about 3 weeks and change to get the demo out. All right, time to execute on that plan. So the first milestone was an event called Twin Cities Playtest, which is a local event hosted by our IGDA Twin Cities community for just bringing your game and getting some public feedback on it. So that was 9 days out, so I just started developing. I copied a lot of existing assets and code and shoved it in there and just made it all work. Now, I've had a lot of experience developing dice mechanics from Dice Tower, and I was able to leverage those learnings to make design decisions about what I think would work and what doesn't. Players don't like stopping every 5 minutes or 1 minute to make a lot of dice decisions, so I needed to streamline that process and consolidate the decision making. That's just one example of learnings that I leveraged. And then I did not do any code refactors unless I absolutely have to, which meant a lot of the stuff that I was pulling in from existing work is literally named the same as it was then, which is absolutely not appropriate for this project, but it works, it doesn't matter. And then just the bare bones UI and UX to get everything going. It's a little bit small now that I'm looking at it, but that's an example of what the UI started out looking like before all of it got tweaked. Got it to the playtest, got some good feedback on what needed to change, so I moved on to the next milestone, which was getting the Steam page and demo out. So I needed to make the run session playable, so a run in Gun Commando is you kill waves of enemies, you level up in between, choose what dice go onto your guns, and you keep doing that until you reach the final wave or you die. That's a run session. Got to get all that working. And then enough content to make for an okay demo. So not the full scope, obviously, but enough that you can kind of get the picture of where it's going. And then I continue to refine the UI and the UX because anytime you're doing anything with choice, UI is a huge component to that. And making sure that it's an intuitive enough experience that you don't have to throw a huge wall of text at the player, because they don't read it anyway. And then finally, I had to, get Steam approval for the build. Whoops, I forgot about that step. So, next milestone, demo launch take 2, because I wasn't able to make that first milestone because of this. But I still launched the Steam page. And then because I got this all up so quickly, I was able to start playtesting with my local cadre of playtesters and get their feedback. Now, I just moved on, pushed the deadline out a couple of weeks, and moved on. Fixed whatever issues Steam had with the demo to get them to approve the build. I did get more of a chance to polish and add content, which proved fortuitous because I had something I could have released, but what I wound up releasing was a lot better, so that extra 2 weeks was worthwhile. But it still wasn't the full scope of what I thought I was going to release at that point, so I made a ton of cuts. And it was all stuff that at the time I thought, this is going to be important. But I organized it by priority, so I just started trimming off the end of that list, and what was left, well, that wound up being the actual core of the game. And all of this was just to get it out the freaking door. And then finally, I launched it. That was my first time ever actually launching something on Steam, so mission accomplished. The demo's out there. It took 47 days from the time that I started working on Gun Commando to demo up on Steam. All right, so what did I learn from that exactly? First of all, the core idea was strong. There was an initial learning curve because players aren't necessarily used to playing an action game and then suddenly being asked to make strategic choices. So once you got past that, though, the mechanics themselves were fairly intuitive to understand, and building dice synergies with gunplay, that was a pretty addicting loop. The next thing I learned is that speed requires trade-offs. I can't make everything perfect, and if there's anything I've learned over the years is that if I try to make something perfect, it's still wrong anyway, so it doesn't matter how much time I put into it. Better to just get it out there and then figure out what's wrong and improve it from there. And then planning by priority made cuts a lot easier so that I could just say, okay, this is the thing that's on the end of the list. I'll just cut that off. This is the part that is closer to where I'm currently at. This needs to get done. And I just kind of felt that out, but it worked out pretty well. And then because I didn't spend time trying to make perfect systems, I avoided time waste from throwing away those non-existent perfect systems. But the biggest takeaway that I got from all of this was I did not consider the marketing factors early enough in this process. Now, I had intended to do marketing, and I thought, okay, well, once I get the demo up and it's presentable, then that's when I'll start focusing on marketing. No, I should have considered it from the start, because one of those decisions I made early was doing the dark lighting with flashlight aesthetic. And while that looks cool and feels good to play, it means all of the screenshots look the same, which is not great when you're trying to market how wide a variety of content your game has. And then I tried to get that demo out as soon as possible, but by doing so, I wasn't considering when I was releasing the demo, and that Steam boosts your visibility when you push the demo out the first time. So I only had less than 100 wish lists when I launched it, and I basically squandered that opportunity for a mulp because I went too early before getting more of a chance to collect them. And then no social media buildup. I said, wait till I have something presentable. I think I should have gone much more heavily into just streaming more of my design process. Well, not necessarily streaming, but just posting about its progress, because you can at least get some traction going from that before you get things fully visualized in the game proper. And that's something that I should have been doing from the start. All right, but all of that said, the concept seemed good enough. There we go. That I decided to keep going. I considered this a successful pivot, committed to it, released the demo in 1.5 months, which meant I didn't kill it with perfection like I feel like I did with Dice Tower. And then the simplified gameplay did in fact mean I could make content faster, and it also had the side effect of people got it more easily, which made it more accessible. And then, because I worked with my skills and primarily used asset packs, I learned that as long as you make something look cohesive, it really doesn't matter how bad the art is, it kind of just works. All right, so that was the demo post-mortem. A lot of these lessons I applied for basically the remaining 4.5 months of Dice Gun Commando's development, and now version 1.0 is releasing this Friday on July 4th, 2026. So, if you like the idea, feel free to check it out. Thank you.
Yeah, so you mentioned that your total timeline is fairly small as well. Oh, thank you. You mentioned that your total timeline for the full production release is actually also pretty tight. How did you take the demo to the full release, and what were the kind of thought processes you had when cutting out extra content if necessary?
It was kind of similar. Instead of a giant to-do list, I made a Notion task board and kind of plotted out like the major features that I wanted to have for 1.0, and then I organized them by what I felt was important from a priority standpoint and started developing. And the closer I've gotten to the release, the more stuff I've just been cutting off of that list until now. We're about here. Yeah. There's still a couple of things I need to get in, really, but overall, it's mostly worked the same way and worked pretty well.
Hi. I'm curious about your work day when you have these tight deadlines. Do you work like 9 to 5 or do you crunch? Like what's your work?
Okay. The question was, how was my work life in order to make this accelerated deadline possible? So initially it was a 9 to 5 and I kept pretty close to that. The closer I got to hitting milestone deadlines, the more crunch started factoring in, which I feel like is fairly normal for game development. It is something that I do consider, why did I crunch? So I hopefully have to do that less going forward, but I would say, yeah, it was a mix of both.
That was really impressive. Oh, I just want to say that was really impressive and kind of inspiring as far as trying to discipline yourself to do this. Did you face any challenges in that respect of getting up that day and just not wanting to do any work?
Yeah, there's definitely been quite a few days where I've just not felt it and I've had to force myself through it anyway. Fortunately, I've had a lot of experience doing that because before I worked on games full time, I had a day job and I basically got myself doing 16 hours a week worth of side project game dev work, and that required me to have kind of a rigid schedule. I actually gave an entire talk about how I did that process that's on YouTube for my IGDA chapters. So if you want to hear a little bit more about that, you can look that up. But it basically boiled down to establish patterns and consistency and just at least always make some amount of progress every day. I'm not seeing any more hands. I think we're good. Thank you.